Welcome to This Week in Heresy, episode 66, Wholeness and Humanness, with our guest via Skype, Laine DeLaney. Hey Laine, welcome to This Week in Heresy.
Hi, thanks. Thank you for having me.
So for the sake of my audience, could you introduce yourself and talk about who you are and what you do?
Okay, that's a broad topic. My name's Laine. I write under the pen name Laine DeLaney. There's a history there, but there's always a long story with me. So, I write a couple of blogs currently, a couple of pagan-themed blogs, Pagan Church Lady, as well as doing a bi-weekly post on Patheos Pagan under the title The Lady's Quill. I'm a heathen, which is a northern European pagan, a member of a sort of Reconstructionist tradition of heathenry. And what I do right now in general, whereas it comes to spiritual paths and things like that, I'm a devotee of Freya. I've taken a private oath to her, and round about 12th night, I'm considering doing a public oath of service to her as well, which will change things a little bit for me. But currently, a lot of people do reach out to me asking questions about her, and if I don't know the answer, I'm sure that I can point people in the right direction, because she has a lot of followers among modern day heathens and other branches of paganism as well. So I do other writing. I've worked as an activist for LGBT rights. I'm transgender, so I've done a lot of trans rights activism, but I've also done a lot of bi and pan awareness and poly awareness as well. And I used to write for a newspaper in Rochester called The Empty Closet. The Empty Closet is the USA's longest running LGBT newspaper, longest continuously running, having run without break since 1971, and it's the only one that's currently archived in the Smithsonian. So I wrote for them for a while I was living in Rochester, and for some other online publications, Transalliance of Greater Rochester's website, and a couple for Planet Transgender and other pages like that. So I write a lot.
Awesome. So let me ask you about your heathenry path, but actually your spiritual path, because I remember because in the email that you sent to me originally, you had quite an interesting path to where you are spiritually. So could you talk about that, please?
Sure. I've been in a lot of different places. When I was raised Episcopalian. It was a very lax religious upbringing. We didn't have a lot of information on the church itself, and we didn't attend church very much. My mom was very much a seeker at that point in time. And early in my childhood, she discovered Islam and felt a call to it. So she became Muslim in short order, and eventually I converted because it's because it was my mom's faith and what she practiced, and I found a lot of things that were interesting and appealing about it as a 6-year-old. You got to learn another language, you got to learn what to me was like magical invocations. Now, mind you, when I was a kid, I like to consider myself, even though I disagree that there's necessarily a broader meaning to it. I like to consider myself having been a natural pagan, because when I was a little kid, I was fascinated by the idea of different gods, and I even tried to set up a little altar. I didn't know what I was doing with it, but I used little figurines and toys that were around the house for it as symbols of veneration. I just didn't quite make the connection. And also part of that when I was young was that I was introduced to Norse mythology at a very young age, having read a choose-your-own-adventure book called The Trumpet of Terror. And the Trumpet of Terror is set in somewhere in Viking-era Scandinavia, and it's an adventure through the Norse 9 worlds. So that made a huge impression on me when I was a kid.
Interesting.
And so my mom accepted Islam and married an Egyptian software engineer, and he worked in Saudi Arabia. So my older sister, who was a teenager at the time, decided to stay behind, but my mom and I decided to go live with my stepfather for a while. And it was supposed to be only a very short period of time that we were there, but we ended up being there a very, very long period of time, from around the time I was about 6 years old to about the time I was 17. So I was there for the first Gulf War, which not a lot of people remember, but in the early 90s we had another Gulf War against Iraq when Iraq was rolling in on Kuwait and threatening our other allies in the region. I remember trying to leave the country. At that point, we were trying to go back to the States because we would visit every summer anyway, but we wanted to be somewhere safe. The news on TV was filled with warnings about how to avoid having cyanide gas leak in the vents in your house, stuff like that. And my mom thought it wasn't a healthy environment for our family. I wonder why.
Gee, right.
And so we got on a plane to leave, and the plane was taxiing on the runway, and it stopped, and nobody knew why it stopped, and it was there for about 45 minutes before the pilot announced that there's a B-52 bomber blocking the runway, and that Operation Desert Shield had officially become Operation Desert Storm, so it ceased to be a defensive and started to become an offense, and it was an actual genuine war. So it was about a year and a half before we were able to get a plane out of the country again. And after we took off, while we were still making altitude, we got the message that the battle for Kuwait was completed and the war was essentially over. But we ended up staying in the U.S. for another 2 years anyway because we kind of wanted to be there. We went back and forth for a while between countries, and I was having a lot of crises of faith at the time. A lot of people do during their teenage years when they start to mature and they're starting to learn what the world's like and vis-a-vis how people, their scripture and how it relates to how people actually follow their scripture or not. And I was at a very difficult point in my late teens where my mom wanted me to stay in Saudi Arabia and go to a religious school and become an imam, become a religious leader in the communities there. And I couldn't, there was no part of me that was okay with this. And I found a few things in the Quran that gave me enough leeway in how I felt about my life that I felt that I could move on. Spiritually and physically, and I did one of the most difficult things in my life, which was telling my mom no at that point, and going back to the States for school, regardless of how she felt about it. And I've lived here ever since. I went back to Buffalo, New York, which was where my family was, and I ended up moving to Rochester later, and now I'm in San Diego. But it took a good long time. While I was in Buffalo, I had friends who would go to a pagan coffee night. And the pagan coffee night happened once a month. And I was also an anthropology student because my grandmother was an anthropologist. So it's kind of a family tradition. Mm-hmm. And one of the projects that we had was to attend a service or a get-together of a religion that you weren't a member of. So I went to pagan coffee and I saw that they weren't evil people. They were actually kind of cool people and good people. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time exploring. I joined a teaching group, a students group, basically, that was a year and a day dedication with a local coven. I studied with them. There was a point where we moved on because they weren't looking for new members, but they opened doors for us. And one of the varieties of paganism that people had talked about that it had interested me was Asatru, which is one of the names that the northern practice goes by. But when I was first exposed to it in the mid to late 90s, like probably 96 or 97, the people that I encountered were I didn't fit in well with the group that I encountered. Mm-hmm. I was told that only warriors could be Asatru, only people who were in specifically military or military-related professions. And there was a lot of code word racism too, which made me really uncomfortable. There was a lot of fearful that made me really uncomfortable. So I moved on, and I kind of was an eclectic pagan for a long time. I leaned towards the Wiccan label because that was where my original training had been, and that's the environment that I felt comfortable with. And most of modern eclectic paganism is based around Wicca in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But I would always return to the gods of the North as the deities that I venerated and the ones who are the most important to me. And for a while, that did change for a while because I was seeking connection to someone who could guide me. And the Egyptian deity Isis, Iset, was there for me for a long time and was helpful in guiding me in a period where I was dealing with a lot of difficulty in finding my place in the world. And she pushed me in a direction, and I ended up squarely back in heathenry as a result, but with different people, with different perspective, with a different understanding of it, with the realization that there are a lot of different types of heathen, a lot of different types of people who practice our faith. And while we do have a kind of tribal thing where a lot of our kindreds are kind of exclusive and they make sure that people fit in before they join, which honestly was not too different from Wicca back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
And in a lot of cases, a lot of covens are like that too, and with good reason. You want to make sure that you're practicing with people that you respect and that are good with you. But I published a couple of articles about why I couldn't be a heathen. And a lot of it had to do with the issues that I had back in the day and seeing them pop up again. The racism, the anti-spiritual attitude that there is in a lot of heathenry. For a lot of folks, they seem to take it as a reconstruction of folk practice and not a religion to be taken seriously. So it kind of leans a little bit more a society for the creative anachronism in some ways for some folks. And a list of other problems, misogyny. It's a huge one.
Right.
So our communities do have their problems and do have issues, but the responses to them, and of course there were trolls, of course there were people who were really negative, but most of the responses were positive, and it was people popping up and saying, hey, I'm queer and I'm heathen. Don't let that stop you. Or, hey, I'm as woo-woo as you are and I'm heathen. Don't let that stop you. And things like that. Heathens of color came forward and spoke. Other people spoke of having the same problem and ended up sharing my post because they wanted to be able to express those same things and those same feelings. And that really changed how I felt about the movement. So I was able to move from a more eclectic viewpoint to being able to claim something that I had honestly felt at home with since I was a little kid, but didn't have a good way of approaching and embracing. So I like to tell people that I went from belonging to a faith where alcohol and pork are both forbidden to one where we celebrate gods who ride on pigs by toasting them with alcohol. And that's a version of my journey. So,
well, that's fascinating because, I've heard a lot. I mean, I've interviewed a few other people who were heathen before. And, you tend to hear a lot of the same stuff, and the heathens that I've talked to find it like they're always saying, no, we're not that heathen. Do you find yourself doing that too?
Frequently, yeah. And I try to let people know, see, it used to be that there were certain words that would work, that you could use that helped to demarcate what sort of heathen you were. You could say that you were a universalist as opposed to folkish, because for a while people used the word folkish to mean racially exclusive. People still generally use the term folkish to mean racially exclusive, but the term has loosened up a lot recently, and some people use it to mean tribalist, which is, I look out for my people first. My own people can be anyone, it's the people who are important to me, my family and my kin. And for a lot of people who use folkish in that term, it's not restricted by race or anything like that. And you do have people who encounter Asatru and other branches of heathenry in jail, and those are often tied in with white power groups and organizations. Then you have people, the next grade is people who are just folkish. They believe that you have to be of Northern European descent to follow our gods. Now, one of my problems with that is that there is no pure blood anywhere. There are no, while race is definitely a social construction, it's still meaningful, and it's important to take into account the racial differences between people. If you're going to give me some kind of lecture on metagenetics and why our gods are only going to listen to or should only be worshipped by people of a certain ancestry, you need to take into account that some of your ancestors weren't white, no matter who you are and where you came from. Right. And unless your ancestry is from a very tiny, geographically isolated village, you have a lot of things in you that you don't know, and a lot of things in your history and your ancestry, and you'd think people would be interested in it, especially in a faith that encourages ancestor veneration, because Well, your ancestry just opened up by realizing that. But more often than not, it's not like they look into your birth charts or DNA. They look at the color of your skin and decide whether or not you should be a member. And, there are, your skin color is not a great indication of your overall ancestry either. And I don't know. I'm not somebody who believes the term metagenetics has been coined to explain the idea of a spiritual connection between your ancestry and the faith that you should practice or you should be allowed to practice. And I'm not necessarily on board with it. The gods call who they will,
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I agree with you. And it just seems like, it's not the only tradition, heathenry is not the only tradition to have those issues. And
it's like that too.
Yeah. And it's funny because it's like, I don't think, like you said, the gods are going to call who they will.
Yeah.
But it also kind of gets into a sticky area of cultural appropriation because there's a lot of people that really have a very strong and narrow definition of cultural appropriation. And I've heard it bandied around about like, oh, well, if you're not Northern European, then that's cultural appropriation. And I'm like, I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's a tough one, but what it comes down to is that we're not practicing the culture of our ancestors. I like to use the Jurassic Park example of it. We don't have enough cultural DNA to perfectly reconstruct Germanic practices from whatever year you choose. I mean, the entire Viking era, what people think of as the Viking era, was a period of hundreds of years. And the countries that we think of associated with it span hundreds of miles. There were lots of different tribes and lots of different practices. There are heathens that will approach, you will have Anglo-Saxon heathens, you will have, Scandinavian heathens, people who try to base the reconstruction off of their faith, off of one region and one set of practices. But I'm going to be honest, I don't believe that it's possible to have build a satisfying religion out of the bits and fragments that we have. So what do? We fill in the blanks. We fill in the blanks with things from our own culture. We fill in the blanks with things from other cultures. And really, in a lot of ways, it's a matter of who is willing to admit that we're filling these blanks in or not. There isn't much in the way of unbroken tradition. There may be a few groups in a few areas, like in Iceland, that have, and in Pennsylvania Dutch country with their Glawe, that do have some sort of unbroken tradition back to the old days, but even those have ended up being heavily Christianized. So the culture doesn't exist that we're trying to recreate, or that people are claiming that is being appropriated, doesn't exist. And it's something that we're trying to create whole cloth, largely from bits and pieces left over. The other part of it being is that a lot of the arguments based around cultural appropriation, and this is one thing that a lot of people ignore power dynamic. A huge part of appropriation is power dynamic between colonial and non-colonial forces. And I'm sorry, Scandinavia Scandinavian countries, Germanic countries, and European countries were the ones doing the colonizing.
Right.
So most often when people complain about appropriation being used and saying, well, how can, why is it not appropriation for someone who's not white to worship Odin, whereas it's appropriation for someone who's not white or someone who is white to wear dreads? There's a lot that goes into that, and a lot of it does have to do with the colonialist power dynamic and who had the upper hand and who still does. How dreads are viewed in our current society, the exotification of them, the commodification of different people's stuff. Now, mind you, I don't know 100% where I stand on cultural appropriation, but what I like to do is when somebody says, please stop this is hurting me, I like listening to them because I think that's the smart thing to do, or at least the kind thing to do. And so... Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I agree. And you want to try and go for the road of greatest compassion.
Yeah, generally.
Yeah. And I find it easier to do that than not.
Well, yeah. And well, with cultural appropriation, it is a really dicey topic. There are people who will say that white people shouldn't eat curry. And if you get down to white people only eating white food, wearing white clothes, and listening to white music, that sounds kind of racist coming out the other end, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's an understanding, I think, that there are some things that belong to closed systems or closed parts of a culture, that taking those things on for yourself should come with some sort of understanding of what they are and what they mean. And the fact that you are taking those things on means that you are identifying with them. So you shouldn't be surprised if people identify you with them. And there's a responsibility, especially for cultures and and groups of people, that a lot of these folks a lot of these things that people complain about being appropriated come from cultures that are fighting for their identity. If you're a Native American in the US, you have to fight to maintain that cultural identity or it'll go away, because the larger overculture is bigger and more solid, and it has already done its part in trying to wear that away. So it's understandable that people would be troubled by folks claiming practices and claiming articles of, ceremonial clothing and things like that from Native American cultures, because they're trying to maintain that level of significance for their own people. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And usually what I like to think about it, because I like to use different spiritual and magical tech. Yeah. And if it's something that I become proficient in, but I know it's not something that it's not mine. Like, it's like citation needed, right? So, usually what I'll do is like, okay, this tech comes from here. Mm-hmm. I know how to use it, but if you want to go deeper into this, or if you want to learn more about the tradition that it comes from, because I'm not an expert in that tradition, then I have people I can hook you up with, or, here's some books, here's some pages, here's places you can go to learn more, but it is not mine.
Mm-hmm. And that seems like the respectful way to do it, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. Going back to your story a bit.
Yeah.
I'm a multi-faith practitioner, and so I like to talk about the intersections of different traditions.
Okay.
And I was wondering if any of your Islamic practice or any of your history with that has kind of come over into your heathen practice, or any of your other, any iteration of your pagan practice that you've been through.
Well, before I started focusing on heathenry, there were certain things that came from Islamic practice that I did observe, and I'm still trying to figure out if any of them fit into my current practice in my current way. One of them is basically people would consider it mantra work, or mantra style meditation. Again, not to use the culturally incorrect term for it. In Islam, it's called dhikr, which means to remember. You recite the name in Islam. You recite the name of God, one of the names of God, over and over again, to give yourself a familiarity and a connection with God, and also to give yourself hope for blessings and the blessings that come from that kind of connection. And that kind of mantra work was very helpful to me when I was more of an eclectic pagan, with certain deities and certain powers from different pantheons. Different ones reacted differently to it, I discovered, which was interesting. And part of the reason that I don't use it much is because when I've done that with Norse deities, I often get a feeling of impatience and yes, I'm here. Yes, I'm listening. Why do you keep repeating my name? But whereas with deities from practices and origins where the name itself was considered a holy word, or the name and the sounds that made up the name had a spiritual significance, like with Egyptian and Kemetic practice, that's definitely something that worked well and was beneficial. I mean, I think that a sense of discipline, an idea of owning and maintaining a level of responsibility for yourself and your own actions, taking care of your own. I think those have carried over well from my childhood into my current practice and my current belief system, but a lot of those are more moral rather than spiritual tech. There isn't really any carryover of spiritual tech from my youth, from the faith I practiced in my youth to current. So
That's interesting. Just to, if I'm remembering correctly, heathenry and Islam share similar-ish hospitality practices, right?
yeah, hospitality. One of the things that I've discovered is that hospitality is a very important old world value, and it's one that I think we've kind of left behind a lot in the new world.
Yeah.
And there are different. And again, culturally, there are different ways that it's established. In the Middle East, I discovered there was a kind of dance about it where you would offer something to a guest, but the guest was expected to decline it. But if the guest didn't decline it, you were expected to give it to them. And if you offer a guest food or drink, they really have to eat. It's impolite if they do not accept your hospitality, but it's really impolite if you don't offer it to them. You're supposed to treat them as well as, if not better than, people in your family. And heathenry, among other, reconstructed Indo-European-based faiths, does have a very strong emphasis on hospitality. We've got the story of Grimnismal, which is the song of Grimnir, which is one of Odin's names. It means the hooded or masked one, which ends up being a very typical Indo-European hospitality warning story. Usually, I'm sure you're familiar with it. The gods show up unannounced and in a different guise at somebody's house just to test how well they're going to treat strangers. Right. And in this case, there was some messing around because Frigga ended up putting the word ahead that there was a strange sorcerer wandering the land who was dangerous, and you would know him because dogs wouldn't attack him. And so when Odin shows up at Gerrialf was the name of the king, shows up at his hall, and the king notices that the dogs are shying away from him. He binds him and puts him between two flames, ties him up between two flames, and tells nobody to feed him or support him. And at the end, I think it's 9 days and nights because 9's that big number for the Norse, Mm-hmm. Odin ends up cursing Gerrialf and passing the legitimate title down to his son, or making sure that his son, who actually showed him some mercy and helped him out. And that's how that dynasty changed in that story. And you see these stories, these hospitality teaching tales throughout different Indo-European cultures. I know vaguely of a Hellenic one. And I'm sure I've definitely heard Celtic ones before. And so it's no surprise that sort of thing shows up in the Middle East as well, because the Indo-European peoples did move straight through the Middle East, roll right through it over the many millennia that it took for them to complete continue their migration. It might have been a native value to the region before that. I'm not really sure, and we don't have a lot of information on that period back there. But yeah, hospitality is important in both faiths. If you bring someone into your house, they're your responsibility, and they also have a responsibility to treat your home well, because part of hospitality belongs to the person who is giving hospitality, and part it belongs to the person receiving it. You don't take too much from your host. You don't take more than they can spare, or more than they can offer. Even if they're offering it to you, it's still bad form to do it. Now, again, there's some argument about that because we've got lots of different values that we observe in heathenry. There's frith, which is a kind of enforced peace. It's often translated as peace, but the concept behind it is that there's someone who's there to maintain frith. Usually, the leader of, a king maintains frith through his soldiers and stuff. Any sort of leader is supposed to maintain it. Otherwise, that's not what it is. It's an enforced peace, like I said. Mm-hmm. But there's also the concept of grith, which is the interactions that you have with people outside of your own inner yard, of your own folk, and how you treat people outside of that. And there is a whole panoply of different ways people apply that to different situations. And it's another one where we don't really have an answer. Where on one extreme end, you have people who say, well, if they're not in my tribe, they don't matter, and it doesn't matter what I do or say to them. And other folk more towards my end, which who say, well, if they're not in my tribe, I'm going to give them a chance. And besides, I mean, I'm not extremely tribalist. I do have my people and I do take care of my people, but my people aren't specifically just my kindred. It's also, that my friends and loved ones who are connected to me in other ways. I think most humans do that, though, in some way.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are similarities when it comes to hospitality. Other similarities, like I said, responsibility, maintaining a sense of honor, although honor varies greatly from culture to culture and tribe to tribe. Honesty, integrity is important. Integrity is a big thing for me too. It's something that I also belong to ADF, to Unreaft Bane, which is a pan-Indo-European pagan organization that is involved with. We have different hearths for different cultures. Mm-hmm. So we've got a Norse hearth, a Celtic hearth, a Roman hearth. And I belong to the Norse hearth for that. And one of the virtues that ADF espouses is integrity. So I had to look up the origin of the word to write my essay on it, because we all write essays on the virtues early on. And integrity means wholeness. And that triggered a few things in me, and I realized that I think that, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but someone who is not a very trustworthy person also doesn't trust people very well.
Right.
Has difficulty trusting other people, and I think it's because they see a lot of themselves. People project.
Right.
And I personally feel that when you break your word, or when you make a promise to someone, or when you make some kind of statement that they are relying on or trusting in, you're forming a bond between the two of you. And when you break that word, or you lie about that statement, that's kind of ripping that bond out, and it reduces your sense of self and their sense of self, and the stability of both people. Thus, integrity. It makes holes in your integrity and your wholeness. And I think one of the most important ways to build confidence, build a good sense of self, build good fortune in your life is to work to establish and create that sense of integrity, that wholeness within yourself, by speaking truthfully and by keeping promises, not making promises that you can't keep, not weaseling around them too, Mm-hmm. And that's natural. I always have the urge to weasel around promises, especially when it's something I don't want to do. But
right.
But you always feel a little pang of loss when you do that, and that builds up over time until you can't trust yourself. So how can you trust anyone else?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a big part of hospitality and inclusion, because I've known there's a few heathens I know that are working to bring the idea of heathen hospitality and radical inclusion together, which I think is really awesome, and it really does go together, and I think actually even a lot of Christian churches are really taking that concept of radical hospitality along with radical inclusion. Mm-hmm. And I think part of being hospitable is accepting the person coming to you in their humanness, and if they tell you that they're X, Y, or Z, then you accept them in their humanness as X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And, not questioning their identity and not telling them that they're wrong because they identify a certain way,
Right. Not like I'm not familiar with that at all. So.
Word. Yeah.
Radical inclusiveness, the concept is kind of new to me. Not the overall concept, but there being a word for it, and it kind of a movement and a feeling. It's actually only popped up for me since I moved out to California. Big surprise.
Right.
But I really like it. I think it's a really valuable concept. One of the classes that I go to regularly has a statement of radical inclusion that the teacher reads before every class, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page where it comes to that. And I like your description of it, of seeing a person's humanness and accepting them as they present themselves, and as they listening to what they say about themselves before you make a decision, or allowing what they say about themselves to influence your decisions about them too, rather than just telling them who they are, when honestly everyone knows better than anyone else who they actually are.
Right.
So,
well, and also accepting their humanness too, because the way I see radical inclusion, and it was a lot of my work in seminary was around radical inclusion, and I worked at a radically inclusive church, City Refuge in Oakland, and part of that, the part of radical inclusion, besides accepting people as they are and as they come to you, is also accepting their humanness, and that they're going to make mistakes, and that there's going to be fights, and there's going to be misunderstandings, and that's a normal part of life, and not something to be like, oh my God, this is so horrible, I hate you now, and I'm not going to talk to you forever and ever, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And humanness is tied into humanization and dehumanization too. The people who end up being discriminated against the most are people who have been dehumanized by current culture, and one of the best ways to overcome that is by exposing people to that humanness. In my LGBT activism work, that's been a big thing for me. Making eye contact with people, talking with them casually about things can be really helpful for that too. Someone I knew felt threatened because she's Muslim and she lives in small town Louisiana, and there was a local mosque got set on fire. Anti-Muslim literature was spread everywhere. People were threatened. They were given threats. And one of the first things I asked her was like, "Do you know your neighbors?" And she's like, "No, not really." And I'm like, "Okay, get to know your neighbors. This is really, really important. Borrow something from them if you can. Do the proverbial borrowing a cup of sugar. Invite them over for dinner. I don't know. Make them pie for dessert or something and bring it over." Yeah. Because they're not seeing you. They're seeing your headscarf, and they're not identifying with you as a human. So the best way to do that, to get past that, is to break through that barrier and humanize yourself to people. And once you do that, that's when they can start making those exceptions. As terrible as it might sound, they can start saying, well, I know a Muslim and they're not like this. And they can start changing. That gives them a place from which to change their opinions about a body of people. And there will always be problematic aspects, no matter what way you cut, slice, or dice different human populations, whether it's by religion or race or anything like that. There will always be problems that are focused in certain areas and that will manifest in certain ways in those areas. And because we have such a broad culture with so many human beings, it's really easy for us to take the first loudest and brightest thing that we see and use that as the color that we paint everyone with.
Right.
But look in people's eyes. That was another thing that I did a lot of, or like I was saying, LGBT activism. When I was in Rochester, we had the Pride Parade, and for a lot of people in the Pride Parade, it's a celebration because, hey, marriage equality is passed and stuff like that. And for the trans people, the Pride Parade was still a kind of grim protest in a lot of ways. I mean, we were still celebrating, but we were, New York State, it's still completely legal to discriminate against trans people for things like housing, employment, emergency medical care, which is terrifying. Mm-hmm. And there are municipalities that have made exceptions, but you can work in one city and get fired in another one. So we'd be in the Pride Parade, and everybody would be bouncing and cheering and smiling up until we came up, and they'd turn around and look at us, and not all the people, but a lot of people would look like they just bit into a lemon when they saw us and get kind of like, or turn away from us. We actually had people turning their backs on us in the middle of a Pride Parade. So one of the things that I found that was really important was to look in the eyes of the people whose faces fell or who, made sour faces, look straight into their eyes and scream happy pride at them and kind of beam that out at them too, to make that human connection with them, even if very, very briefly, just to let them know that that there was a person on the other end of these eyes. So,
right. Well, and that's the thing, making that connection, because it's easy for us as humans in general, and I know this is a generalization and all.
yeah,
It's easy for us to kind of have that tribal thing going on where it's like you're either in the group or you're not.
right.
And that's the easy path for us. That's what's kind of evolutionarily hardwired. And it's harder to make more of the leap and saying, okay, I'm going to go out of that little tribal thing and go above this us and them thing and be like, hey, that's a person. That's another human being there. I should get to know that person. And it's interesting because I've been working in radical inclusion so long that it's like it's starting to become second nature now. I mean, sure, I make mistakes and I still have, and I always have plenty of work to do.
Right, yeah.
But it's easy. It's really easy for me now. It's easier for me now to make that leap. Mm-hmm. And it gets frustrating sometimes when people who are just learning, and I try to remind myself, okay, some people are in this space and some people are this way. I just have to accept them where they're at, because it's like, don't you get it?
That can be really difficult. I know. Yeah.
But it is a hard leap, especially, I would say, especially in Western society, US a lot, especially nowadays, mm-hmm. is pretty hard. But I think in Western society as a whole, that's really hard to make the leap for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree on that. Making that kind of connection with strangers, especially if it's people that you've already been given a certain idea about, or had a mask that you've been taught to put on them. So, and but it's helpful, and there are stages, and sometimes it's really difficult to be patient with allies who are trying but who do not, who still aren't getting it, and there's a lot of difficulty that can come of that. Somebody's trying to be supportive but says the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. This happens all the time in life, and sometimes you can't react well to that either. Sometimes you just don't have the mental energy to react positively to it. Sometimes you just feel so worn down already that hearing something like that does, push you a little bit over the edge. And if you're part of a population that experiences regular microaggressions like all the time and every day, that's gonna build up over time. So you always get these stereotypes of the shrill woman, the aggressive Black person, the in-your-face trans person, arguing for their rights. And part of the reason that we get that way, that people get that way, is just it's hard for everyone to realize what going through that kind of thing on a day-to-day basis is like, dealing with that sort of thing on a day-to-day basis is like. So you can't always be patient as much as you want to be. And I guess in some ways that's the real litmus test too, because an actual ally is somebody who will see us flipping out, who might be upset, because it's hard not to be upset if somebody flips out at you. But the allies who are just there to get a pat on the back are the ones who are like, well, you were mean to me, so now I don't care about your human rights anymore, versus the ones who are like, I don't want to say the wrong thing, help, what do I do? Mm-hmm. Next time. So it's, like I said, it's natural for people to react the way we do, and it's natural for people to react the way other people do when you're in that environment. You were talking about humanness. We've all got these little hang-ups and rough spots, and we're gonna rub off, we're gonna rub each other the wrong way at some point, but it's the mature folks who can get past that and move on. So. Mm-hmm.
And to really be able to even talk within the anger too, I think.
Yeah.
Like being real about, I was hurt, I'm angry, I'm, and letting that show, and yet still having some patience with the people that have, even especially those who have inadvertently done it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, there is a difference between like pure ignorance and somebody doing maliciously. And now, Now, if somebody's doing it maliciously, I don't have any problem being like, dude, you're being a jerk, or other colorful language. But, but if somebody's doing it out of ignorance, you want to let that anger show so that they know that it's, and that hurt show, because you want them, you want the lesson to stick. But, I think it's good to have at least a little bit of patience to be like, okay, dude, really? That kind of thing.
Well, exposing your pain can also be very humanizing, showing your vulnerabilities that way, and that's, the anger is coming from a place of pain. It almost always is. You've been hurt. That's why you get angry. So, yeah.
And then also, especially if the person who committed the foul, I guess is one way to put it, actually recognizes that and says, I see that you're hurt and I'm sorry, and I will try to fix it. And I think that's healing for the person that was hurt as well, because they got the apology.
Yeah.
I think that's it. And if it happens like that, that can be really good.
Mm-hmm.
All the way around.
Yeah. I know there's someone who, a friend of mine likes talking about the flip side of that, which is he likes to say that we've got a kind of culture of disposability when it comes to people, and how someone can screw up and then apologize for it, but the apology is never good. It is never enough to not bring up the thing that they said 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody changes a lot, and I think that's important to keep in mind. Everyone changes a lot over the course of their life. And I said things 10 years ago that I'm sure I'd be ashamed of right now if I remembered what they were.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, the further back in my life you go, the more stupid things I've said and dumb opinions I've held. And that changes over time. And I think part of it is, hey, with the internet, it's impossible for us to lose. Well, it's hard for us to lose some of this stuff too. You can, there's I think it's a Tumblr called Your Fave is Problematic, where they will find something that your favorite celebrity has said or done that will upset you more likely than not, So yeah, everyone does make mistakes, even when they're well-meaning. And it's important to try and work past that if you actually want to be able to share space with them. And I think that's really important. That's one of the things that I'm approaching in the presentation and workshop that I'm doing at Patheos. It's called Different Tribes, Different Practices. In modern heathenry, we've got a whole lot of you're doing it wrong. And to the point where that's actually kind of joked about as being one of the rules of heathenry, is you're doing it wrong. Because people will jump down your throat about how or what you're doing, and there are so many arguments about so many things. And one of the things that led me to the idea of doing this workshop was the realization that what I was saying earlier, heathenry doesn't come from one thing. People will talk to you about developing a proper heathen mindset. Eventually you'll develop a proper heathen mindset, and then you'll agree with everything I just said.
I'm sorry, that just makes me giggle.
It should, because I think it's kind of ridiculous. There is some value to the concept of a heathen mindset, because a polytheistic Northern European worldview is going to differ from our modern secular Judeo-Christian Western worldview in some ways. And it's helpful to think of the ways those could be, because part of the reason that we're reviving this stuff, or trying to revive this stuff, is because there's value in it. And there's value that's been lost and been left behind. So I understand the concept behind the heathen mindset, but so many people just use that to mean, oh, you don't agree with me, eventually you will. If you don't agree with me, you don't have the proper heathen mindset, as though there was a single way of thinking that everyone in every country that we draw sources from, that we consider heathen, all the way from the time of Germania to the end of the Viking era, thought the same way. There were hundreds of different tribes, and those different tribes practiced differently. There are a lot of big arguments in heathenry about whether you should worship the gods, whether you should worship them regularly, whether it's okay to have personal devotional relationships with them as opposed to, them just being toasted by communities, the pros and cons of both of those. And that's just one example I'll use. And those different viewpoints come from looking at different points in history and looking at different records and different suggestions and extrapolating based off of them. But the fact is, not everybody's going to choose those same moments that you're choosing for it. And there's a lot of cherry picking, and there's going to be a lot of cherry picking to try and create a coherent practice. Because, what they were practicing, what the Irish Vikings were, and the Tormies were practicing is not what they were practicing in Iceland. And that's how they saw things in continental Germany. So there's going to be a brief discussion of how different some of those practices in different tribes were to give us a kind of perspective on our modern heathenry. And then I'm going to go into a workshop portion where I try to encourage an active discussion between members of the, participants in the workshop about those points and trying to find the meeting points. I've been studying nonviolent communication methods, and one of the questions that comes up frequently is where are the needs? What needs aren't being met? Because usually the conflicts arise because some kind of need isn't being met. And we're having these conflicts rocking back and forth across our community, across the heathen communities, especially where it concerns racism, folkism, universalism, but also heterodoxy, whether or not you practice multiple religions, or it's okay to practice multiple religions or honor gods that aren't Northern European alongside your Northern European gods and ancestors. There are debates about Loki, always debates about Loki.
Always debates about Loki. Even I know that one.
Right, yeah. About whether he's okay or whether he's actually a god or just a literary device or this or that or the other thing. There are arguments about how much of our reconstruction should be religion versus how much of it should be entirely culturally based. I lean more towards the religion end of things, but the culture is important to understand the religion. Or the religious aspects of it. So all of these things, I'm going to present a series of things and basically hope that people are able to take different positions on it. And we're going to find where the arguments are coming from and where the needs that aren't being fulfilled are coming from. And what I hope to be able to achieve after having walked out of there was have a room full of people that understand why the other side is arguing what they're arguing for, not necessarily agreeing with it, but finding ways to coexist based off of what needs those arguments represent and those positions represent. I'll be honest, I'm fairly hardline when it comes to the anti-racist stuff. I have a lot of problems with a lot of the organizations, not because they're out and out racist, but because they don't police it in their members or police it better in their membership. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So I don't know if I'm going to come out of this with a different view of how we interact, and maybe there are walls that need to be built in our community that haven't been built, and I'm willing to accept that too, as much as I'd like everyone to get along and everyone to sing the same or similar songs. Good fences also do make good neighbors, and sometimes you need to set a barrier between yourself and other people. You were asking me earlier, do I worry when people ask me if I'm heathen or what do I say? Do I get concerned about? And I do. And part of the reason is because we had the 3 Asatru folks who were accused of firebombing a church just like a month or so ago. And, I talked about it in online communities. There's a lot of discussion on what should we do about this? And so many people are like, well, we need more heathens in law enforcement. And I'm like, how's that going to help? And, we should go out and do charitable work so that people see that not all heathens are like this. And I'm like, that's cool too. My opinion is that we need to own that it's a problem in our community. We need to acknowledge it. We need to acknowledge it publicly, and we need to do what we can inside our communities to deal with it. We need to say, my kindred's not going to be like that. My kindred or hearth, my group is not going to be like that. We need to be able to provide education to each other within our kindreds, within our organizations, education about these social issues, because so very often the social issues get brushed off when you try to talk, especially on internet forums, but also in person, talk to other heathens about them. They say, well, this really isn't the place to talk about race. And I'm like, if we're having a problem with racism, then it is indeed the place to talk about race. And a lot of people are afraid of that kind of confrontation because they're afraid of people walking away from heathenry, creating dividing lines. But, it's a problem that we need to own, because if we don't own it, it's just going to overwhelm us. Ignoring racism, ignoring things, just let them fester and grow.
Exactly. I mean, and I think that's one of the things that people misunderstand about inclusion is inclusion doesn't necessarily mean you don't have boundaries for the protection of people and the people in your group. So you can have boundaries in saying, this is not a racist space. And we don't allow racism in this group. And yet still be clear that you welcome everybody, but this is a boundary that we've had to set,
Yeah, absolutely.
It gets frustrating sometimes because people seem to think that inclusion means you have to include everybody no matter what they do. And that's just not true. It's like, I want to include you and the door is open to include you, but we don't tolerate this kind of behavior here because it harms other people.
I run a group for devotees of Freya on Facebook called Virtual Sessunamnir, and it's been difficult, but it's been less difficult than it could have been for an online heathen group, because, it's not just heathens. Anyone who's called by her is welcome to join. Just most of us lean in that direction, But she also doesn't discriminate. She's poked people of lots of different faiths over time. But in any case, we vet members very carefully. There's myself and one other admin. We have a series of questions that we send people, or statements basically like, these are the rules for our space. Are you okay with this? And we let them in, because there are groups that will come in and deliberately interrupt or troll or cause problems for heathen groups that they don't approve of online. Whether it's because they're not racist enough, or because they're in some way not perfectly historically accurate according to the people who are doing the trolling. There's a group called Do You Even Heathen Bro, or that used to call themselves Do You Even Heathen Bro, that's famous for doing this. And we just don't need that sort of thing. This is supposed to be a space for people to talk about the lady and express their devotion and discuss, ask questions and discuss things about her. And I am sure that there are devotees of Freya who are jerks, but if they're going to be jerks, they're still not welcome.
Right.
Freya, because we need to keep our house clean. So, inclusion doesn't mean including everyone, no matter how trollish they are.
Right.
There's standards of behavior. So,
yeah. Like I said, it's leaving the door open, but having some rules and boundaries, saying, because we want to keep the group healthy. Right.
And we've only had one problem so far, and that was taken care of fairly quickly. We did have to end up blocking somebody and removing them from the group, but it was clear that they weren't there to discuss the things that we were there to discuss. They had their own thing going on. So,
all right. Well, I know we could probably nerd out for a while about stuff, but unfortunately, we are out of time. So if people would like to get in touch with you to talk about heathenry or any of the issues we raised in the show, what would be the best way for people to do so?
Well, I've got an email address, and that works just fine. It's Laine DeLaney 919@gmail.com. It's LAINEDELANEY 919@gmail.com. Also, Pagan Church Lady on WordPress, and I've got a Facebook page for Pagan Church Lady also. So you can always go there and, like the page if you want to, but send me a message in any case, and I'll get the message if you send it to Pagan Church Lady. either the Facebook group or the email or contact that's provided on WordPress as well. In addition, let me throw out here, there's a couple of projects that are coming up over the next couple of months that I'm going to be involved in that I just wanted to spread the word on real quick. There's a myself and John Hyatt, who's one of the members of the local ADF Grove and the local Kindred of the Northern Hammer. We're going to be doing a series of room classes in San Diego over the course of the next year. We're starting on the 3rd Thursday of January, and we're going to meet twice a month. One meeting will be discussing a couple of runes. The next meeting will be practicum and exploration of techniques and things that you can do with those runes. We're hoping to have it run for a year or two to cover the entirety of the Elder Futhark and possibly explore other things. And we'll be dipping into other forms of heathen stuff in the class too, but it's mainly focused on the runes. We're going to call it Gifts of the Weird. We're pretty sure that's also the title that we're doing for our podcast also. We've been recording a few things for a podcast. We wanted to go with Modern Heathens, but there's an atheist group that already uses that. So Gifts of the Weird is probably going to be the name that we release it under, and we're going to start releasing them in January. We wanted to record a few shows before the month that we started letting them out, just to have some backup, basically. And in it, we're going to focus on heathen topics. We're going to be bringing on guests who are closer to the fringe, voices that need to speak, voices that need to, and subjects that we need to talk about. So there are going to be social justice and social type topics. There are also going to be spiritual topics and practices. And we're going, the people running the show are a fairly diverse group in and of ourselves, and we intend our guests to be the same too. So something else to look forward to, and it'll be plastered all over Pagan Church Lady once we get our first show published on our website. So
awesome. And if I'm anticipating this will come out mid-January, so if you have links for before then we could put them in the show notes as well.
That's great. Yeah, I'll send those along to you.
Fabulous.
So thank you for having me on the show, Gina. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for being on. It's been really, really interesting.
Cool. Well, keep in touch. All right? Take care.
I'd like to thank Laine for joining us on This Week in Heresy. You can subscribe to This Week in Heresy via iTunes or the Stitcher app, or follow us on Twitter at TWIH Podcast. You can also financially support this podcast through patreon.com. Thank you very much for listening, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave me a message at thisweekinheresy.com.